today we're continuing a series called Inadequate Me. We're in the book of Judges. You may say, kind of a weird sermon time for a Mother's Day, but hang with me because we're going to be looking at some things that I believe is going to encourage you no matter where you're at. We're looking at the life of Gideon in Judges chapters 6 through 8, and we're looking at his inadequacies, but the faithfulness of God that has shined through. And I got to give a special shout out of thanks to Pastor Steve Webster. Didn't he do a great job leading us through chapter 7 these last couple of weeks? Let's thank him for all he's done. Yeah. Love Pastor Steve. We've got an amazing group of men and ladies who lead and shepherd and love so well here at Blackhawk. But now we're in chapter 8, so join me there, Judges chapter 8. And I got to tell you, this chapter's not really a fun chapter, but I believe God and his faithfulness through our failures. That's what we're looking at today. God's faithfulness through our failures. Whether someone has failed you, whether you have failed, no matter what growing up looked like, what having a mom, not having a mom looked like, no matter what failures you or others have brought to the table, I can assure you today, my brothers and sisters, that my God is faithful. And I got to be honest, too, and tell you that when we get to chapter 8's end, you're going to say, well, where's the faithfulness of God? And I want to remind you today that this is but a sliver in Israel's history. These 3 chapters, Judges 6 through 8, that we're going through, we're in week 5 today. This is just a sliver in the history of the faithfulness of the redemptive plan for salvation that the Lord brings about. And his faithfulness comes because I've read the end of the story, and despite what we're about to walk into and the shifts that took place, our God is always so faithful. And as we get into chapter 8, you would kind of expect it to go straight to verse 28, which we'll get to next week as we close our series. You would expect it to go to, hey, we've come off this great victory. If you remember Gideon chapter 6, he was a coward. He was hiding, he was afraid, but God called him out of his cowardice. He called him to something greater. Chapter 6, he's a coward. Chapter 7, we just finished, he's a conqueror. This coward made conqueror, but now chapter 8, he becomes somewhat of a compromiser. It's a good outline for these 3 chapters. And because of the big victory over the Midianites who had been oppressing Israel, God's people, for over 7 years, this victory has taken place. The first battle has been won. You would expect us to go to chapter 8, verse 28, where things are good. There's some rest, where we enjoy the victory a little bit, but instead, there's 2 things that get in the way. There's internal division, critical spirits. Even bigger than that is the inadequacies and even the character flaws of Gideon. Raise your hand if you've got any inadequacies or character flaws. And now elbow the person who didn't raise their hand, because they do too. When we can relate to Gideon, and boy, I'm going to tell you, this part, it kind of doesn't have the fairy tale ending, as we'll see next week, but we do see the faithfulness and the hand of God, the goodness of God through all of it. We sit here and learn from Gideon, who's in chapter 11 of Hebrews, we'll look at next week at an even greater degree. But let's talk about 3 shifts that took place in Gideon's storyline. 3 shifts that took place in his storyline. The first one comes from the first 3 verses of chapter 8, and it's the shift from unified teamwork. They had to work together and be unified to have a victory, especially 300 men. If you remember, it was their shortage that was the platform for God's strength. It was their trust, even though they had no chance, that led to God's triumph. They had unified teamwork, though, that is now starting to shift to critical division. Verses 1 through 3, we see this, and this is internal division from the tribes of Israel. There are 12 tribes of Israel, and these are the people that Gideon was working with as a team, but now we see a shift, and we see the same shift happening throughout the cycles, not just of Judges, not just of God's justice throughout history, but even throughout culture today. So let's look at verses 1 through 3 of Judges chapter 8. Are you ready for the word today, Blackhawk? Let's dig in. Verse 1, Judges 8. The men of Ephraim said to him, "What is this you've done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they accused him fiercely. This is strong language. They're really raging mad here. Verse 2, here's how Gideon deals with the criticism. And he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian." These are the 2 captured and killed last week in this gruesome story as it unfolds. Oreb and Zeb. "What have I been able to do in comparison with you?" Then you can just take the breath. You can feel the deflation, the de-escalation. Then their anger against him subsided. when he said this. Gideon did some good stuff. I hate to tell you that that's about the last line of what we learn to do from Gideon because it goes south from there. But let's talk about those 3 verses because we see this shift from working together, big victory, unified teamwork, to now this critical spirit that's fostering division. And Ephraim, one of the tribes, the people from this tribe, they had 2 really important cities. They had Shiloh and Bethel. Shiloh was the religious center for the nation of Israel, for the people of God. A lot of worship took place there. They were a hub for that. So they had a little bit of a superiority complex. And you'll find pride can do a lot of things. It'll have a lot to do with the second shift, but it had a lot to do with this first one as well. In Judges chapter 12, let's look at this together. Judges 12:1, they do the same thing again here. Judges 12:1, just 4 chapters later, the men of Ephraim were called to arms, just like they were in this story. They crossed to Zaphon and said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you?" And so what will they do? "We will burn your house over you with fire." All right. Well, that's quite a start. That's quite a shift that we're seeing. That's the kind of people, and that's what pride will do in our lives when we kind of get a holier-than-thou mindset. That would never happen in churches. Religious people never tend to do that, but sometimes it has happened throughout history, and you see it with these people. But here's the thing. Ephraim, they're furious with Gideon. He did, in fact, call them to help, by the way. It wasn't at the beginning of the battle. It was toward the end of the battle, at the end of chapter 7. If you missed last week, go listen to Pastor Steve's message. He did a great job unpacking that. He called them, but it was toward the end of the battle. So they're very critical of their leader, Gideon, for a decision that he made, or in their mind, that he did not make. That happens in society and life, and even in churches too. We don't always understand how God does or does not lead our leadership, and they're very critical of that. And so they make it very well known. They're very upset. And then Gideon kind of gives us this look at how to deal with that criticism. But before we get to Gideon's guide to handling criticism, because we all need that, let's talk about what was going on here in this very moment. They're so furious, and this marks, at least in the book of Judges, the first time, the first place where 2 tribes of Israel are really infighting. They're fighting against each other and becoming divided. And as we look at that, as they had their internal debates, as they paused to deal with criticisms of their leadership, as they paused to fight with one another, the enemy was gaining ground. There were still things to be done to close and finish the battle that God had already given them, that they had already won. So as they were fighting, the enemy was gaining ground. I've shown you this video before, but I couldn't pass it up to show you again. These are 2 gazelles, and they're just going at it. Moms, doesn't this look like your kids? Yeah, and then you kind of feel like the lion that's coming in the background. Do you see him? While they're locking horns, something is approaching in the background. You see their friends leave. They just left them high and dry, didn't they? This is what happens when we get caught up in the shift. The enemy gains ground while we're focused on butting heads. And then we all kind of know where this is going. And don't worry, I cut off the end of the video. We'll stop it there. 1 Peter chapter 5. There are kids in the room, guys. Come on. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." My brothers and sisters, hear me today when I tell you that the enemy wants nothing more than to have us focusing on things that do not have eternal value and fighting with each other, shifting from unified teamwork as the body of Christ to internal critical spirits of division to divide us. Have you noticed the world, culture, and society has trended so far towards critical spirits and divisions, and the enemy wants to gain ground on the body of Christ while we lock horns like the gazelles. But today I want to remind you that our God is victorious, that our God is faithful, and when we trust in Him, He will have us not locking horns against each other, but standing toe to toe, shoulder to shoulder. And in a world that's so divided, the enemy won't gain ground on God's church, the same church about which Jesus said, "I'm going to build my church, and even the gates of hell won't prevail against it." So, my friends, we are called to something higher. Let's stand toe to toe, side by side, facing out, loving a world that is so divided and displaying the unified teamwork that God has called us to exemplify. But we see the shift away from that in Gideon's storyline. And unfortunately, we see a shift away from that in so much of what goes on in our world today. So may that be a good reminder, because with the people of Israel, even in this time of victory, they were their own worst enemy. And sometimes the greatest tool, don't miss this, sometimes the greatest tool the enemy uses to tear down the work of God is the people of God. When we miss what he's trying to do in us and through us and get distracted by non-eternal things. May that never be us. Verses 2-3, Gideon gives us this guide for handling criticism. Anybody ever criticized you before? Well, so here's a good guide. Here's a good guide for you to follow. This is, again, kind of the last little bit of what to do, learning what to do from Gideon. Kind of goes downhill from here. But he displays this humble and selfless calm about him. Here's what he could have done. He could have said, hey, I did call you. Quit lying about me. Quit telling untruth. I did call you. I just didn't call you when you want. He could have gone down that path, but instead, you know what he does? He makes it more about the person, and this is a good thing for us to remember relationship-wise. This is a whole other sermon, but I'm going to give it to you that we learn from Gideon. As you have Mother's Day gatherings, remember this. What Gideon displayed is a humble, selfless, calm, de-escalating posture that made the person more important than winning the argument. Sometimes we like to win points more than we like to win people. Sometimes we like being right more than we like building up the relationship. I've been guilty of that. I don't know about you, but Gideon shows us through his response how to display a de-escalating calm in that situation. And here's what it is, Proverbs 15, verse 1. Proverbs 15:1. This is a great picture of what Gideon did. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So well done, Gideon. But verse 3, got to tell you, look, what's the first word of verse 3 of Judges chapter 8? Shout it out. God. God. It's God. And so it's like, well, okay, he's doing well, right? Well, the word, you won't see it in our English translation, the word that has been used throughout Judges for God typically is Yahweh. It's this superior God who is above all. It's the most respectful term that they would call God. It's Yahweh. But instead, and he doesn't use a bad term, but it's a different term that he uses for God. He goes to a little bit more of a generic term for God. Again, not bad, but different. That's Elohim. And so what he does is and we wouldn't even notice it. And the same thing's true of us. He took a little small step, a little slow fade away from seeing God how he had been seeing God. And that's what we do, isn't it? We'll just be moving on and people don't really notice what's going on. If you're looking at my face, you're hearing the words of my mouth, you see my life, you don't really realize what's happening. But before long, we end up in a spot that we go, now how did I end up on this side of the stage? How did I end up on this side of the fence? How did I end up in this kind of a place in my life? And that's what Gideon is doing, and we see it continue to crumble starting in verse 4. This little small step of not seeing God the way he's seen God in the past, of forgetting the goodness, of forgetting the faithfulness of God will cause us to do the little slow fades that will end up being detrimental to our faith and our walk with God. And Gideon even foreshadows where he's headed, even with his terminologies of the words that he uses. So how many of you have watched a TV show that has multiple storylines going on at once? As we go to these next shifts, that's what's about to happen. You know, there's storyline A, and they kick it off, and they get you leaned in to the television, and you wonder what's going to happen, and they stop. And they go to storyline B, and you go to storyline B, and then they get you really interested there, and then they hop back to storyline A, and then they go back to storyline B, and sometimes there's a C, and before long it's like, well, I can't wait for the next episode because I got to see what's going to happen. You know what that's like. Well, that's kind of what's happening now with these other shifts. There's a couple of storylines coming together and being interwoven together. The first is how Gideon deals with it. We'll call them his friends. It's his fellow countrymen. It's the other tribes of Israel. He's dealing with them. He's asking them for further help and assistance, and we're going to learn he's not going to get it. But he's also dealing with these kings, these Midianite kings that he's going after, Zebah and Zalmunna. Say that a bunch of times, right? Name your kids that, moms. Mother's Day. Zebah and Zalmunna. He's pursuing them, and so we see these two storylines. So we'll hop around and tie those storylines together. So the first shift is unified teamwork, and then it shifts to this critical division. The second shift is away from a grateful praise. They've just won this great victory. They're worshiping God. They should be. Grateful praise to prideful bitterness. Grateful praise to prideful bitterness. And the storyline here is shifting now to Gideon's dealings with the people of Succoth and Peniel. And these are part of his own countrymen, part of his own tribe, part of his own team. This is dealing with supposed friends, but they don't come through. So let's go to verses 4 through 9, and then we'll skip down to verses 13 through 17, and you'll see that storyline, and then we'll go back to the other. You guys with me? All right, this is quite a chapter. Gideon's a mess. Aren't you a mess? This is a good chapter for all of us then. All right, let's go there. Verse 4. And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, please give us loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted. And I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the officials of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand? We'll come back to that we should give bread to your army. Verse 7. So Gideon said, well then, look at your neighbor, say, well then. Some pretty important words. You might want to circle those. We'll come back. Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Great Mother's Day verse. Verse 8. And from there he went up to Peniel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Peniel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Peniel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. And then verse 13, skip down with me to continue this storyline. He does what he promises, this retribution and this reprisal and this retaliation that Gideon steps into. Verse 13, then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? Verse 16, and he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the city. Everybody go, whew, what are we going to do with all that? Let's break that apart for a minute, because what we really see is we're coming off of victory, and this posture of praise, this grateful praise that they had has now started to shift for Gideon to a place of pride. Like, look what I have done. I got this, God. A place of bitterness, and we're going to see his story unfold more and more, and this is how he deals with his friends. They had every reason to rejoice, but. And so I asked you this question, and we've been talking about it all day, and the question is simply this: what most often hinders gratitude in your life? What most often hinders gratitude in your life? And many of you participated through our Facebook live feed, and so I'm going to read actually some of these. I don't even know what all of them are, but we're about to find out together. All right, here you go. What hinders gratitude in your life? Audra says, I'd say disappointment in failed relationships and comparing myself to others. Boy, comparison can lead you to not being grateful real quick, can it? When you start looking left and looking right, you don't look up anymore. I so agree, Audra. Brittany said, sadly, sometimes I focus too much on what others have and always wanting more. Kind of comparison again here, a theme. Or the next thing, instead of sitting back and being thankful for all I do have. Me too, Brittany. Justice said, I would say pride, because sometimes that keeps us from gratitude. Even had Pastor Wees weighing in. He says, when we're tested, we feel like God's far away. It can feel unfair, but he is faithful, and those tests help me grow in my capacity to trust and obey him. All good stuff. Blake says jealousy. Audra says holding grudges. Dave says pride. So these are a few of the answers. Thank you guys for weighing in. We're going to try to do that sometimes, helping me preach today. But pride, I'll end there, because all of those are so true. So much hinders us from having a grateful posture of praise. But in Gideon's life, pride really has seeped in. He starts to think, well, I've got this. I'm good to go. And we know this because in the next 20 or so verses, Yahweh, God, doesn't even speak or be spoken about except in two instances where Gideon really speaks of God, kind of using his prior words for his own agenda. God hasn't spoken again, though, yet Gideon kind of continues down this path. Have you ever taken things in your own hands and then fell flat on your face before? Come on. Is that just me? Gideon's there, and what leads to that is this shift from a grateful posture and perspective of praise and of worship, and a shift to this selfish, prideful bitterness where I want to retaliate and I want to take things in my own hand. I want to do it my way. Perhaps you've been there in your life as well. And I'll tell you, when it comes to pride, I think a lot of our most dangerous spots, the greatest cause of failure, I'll say it this way, the greatest cause of failure could be your current success. If you're successful spiritually or financially or practically or in your career, beware of what the enemy is lurking to do. If you're successful in a moment, a lot of times it creeps in just like it did with Gideon, saying, I've got this. I'll take care of everything ahead. Jim Collins wrote a book, I think it may have been one of his first, if not his first books, Good to Great. You ever read that? Great book, Good to Great. But he followed that book up, I find it interesting, with another book called How the Mighty Fall. Because sometimes the biggest threat to my future following of God, the biggest threat to my future success is my current success, because I might just think that I've got it all together. And success is going to do one of two things, I think, most times. It's going to grow your gratitude, or it's going to produce pride in your life. Let's go through some of these verses. I got to start with verse 4. Where they're exhausted yet pursuing. If that's not a Mother's Day verse, I don't know what is. Can I get an amen, ladies? Exhausted yet pursuing. You don't give up on those babies, but boy, you get exhausted. That's a good parent verse, a good Mother's Day verse. And that's where these 300 men are that God has used so mightily. And then in verses 5 and 6 and then 8 and 9, Gideon is requesting help from Succoth and Penuel, and they tell him no. And they use the hands thing. You remember that weird part in there? It's like, well, show us the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna. Back in this time, if you really won a victory, you would need to prove that you won the victory. If you really destroyed someone, if you really defeated someone, then you would cut the hand off or the head off, and you would bring that to the people you need to prove your victory to. If you think this is gruesome, go back to Judges chapters 3 and 4. You think the Bible's boring? Read the first 8 chapters of Judges, and you're going to say, what? I didn't know this was in here. It's gruesome stuff in history, and Gideon is in the midst of all of that, and he is turned down by his supposed friends. They stab him in the back, and they say, no, we're not helping. So let me ask you this question. What are you supposed to do, or what do you do when your supposed friends stab you in the back? When they turn their back on you? It's often a reality of life, and Gideon is living that, and, he shows us kind of the what not to do. A lot of pride, a lot of bitterness seeps in, and he wants to retaliate with them, and he says, verse 7, well then, say it again, well then. Some versions will say, just for that. And they're both good translations. He says, well then, if that's how it's going to be, let me tell you what I'm going to do. And boy, isn't that us. That's how we naturally drift in our minds. And this root of bitterness has sprung up. Hebrews 12:15 warns us against allowing any shade of a root of bitterness to spring up in our life, because it defiles us and it pulls us away from all that God intends with the purposes he's living out and bringing about in our lives. And bitterness, if you're living in bitterness right now, like Gideon is experiencing, then it's always going to hinder your experience of and your expression of the grace of God. The same grace by which you're saved, if you're a child of the King, it'll hinder your experience and your expression of that grace if you live in bitterness. And we see what it does to Gideon. Look at verses 13 through 15 again. He mocks their doubt and their fear. It's like, well, you don't think this is going to happen? Well, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. The Lord, and he's using the Lord now to mock their doubts and fear. If I was there, I would want to say to Gideon, because, I would mock him, because, do unto others as they do unto you. Isn't that in the Bible? Yeah. Is it? You're supposed to say no. I'll teach on that next week. No, that's not in the Bible. We do unto others as God has done unto us. We love as we've been loved. So I would, though, because I'm so human, probably say something to Gideon like, you hypocrite. You remember the Gideon of chapter 6? Didn't you have a bunch of doubts and fears? And then now you're mocking their doubts and fears? But then I would have to look in the mirror and go, oh yeah, there I am again. I do the same thing. That's what bitterness is doing in Gideon's life. He's mocking the same doubts and fears that God, listen, had incredible mercy and grace as he displayed those same doubts and fears in chapter 6. And in between that is this victory. And so may we be reminded of 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 11, where the Apostle Paul has listed all these sins, these things that we can't get entangled into. But then he reminds us, chapter 6, verse 11, 1 Corinthians, and such were some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. May we remember Ephesians chapter 2, that we are saved by grace through faith, not of works, or then we would boast about it. We would become prideful about it. And a lot of times we get things mixed up, and we put in the place where grateful praise should go, we put prideful bitterness. Speaking of both Mother's Day and putting things where they don't belong, I'll share a quick Mother's Day story of my bride that happened to us this last week. I was working, we were in some meetings, and I got a call from my beautiful bride, Jessica. Happy Mother's Day, by the way, sweetheart. I'm glad you're here. She was singing with our kids earlier, being the awesome mom that she is. But she was an awesome mom to our little 3-year-old Kaya as well. Kaya is all three all the time. She never slows down, always smiling, always making us laugh. But you just kind of never know what she's going to get into. So she had a little plastic sandwich. It was about the size of a thumbnail. And no, she didn't eat it. I wish she would have just eaten it, and this problem probably would have been a lot less. She took this little plastic sandwich from a little playhouse, and she decided to put it in her nose. And then she comes to Mom, and this is the phone call I get, that things you never think you're going to hear as a parent, right? She's saying, "It hurts, Mom, sandwich in my nose." It's like things you never think you're going to hear as a parent. And so, of course, as a good mom, she took her and had to do the x-rays and had to figure out, because, listen, a plastic sandwich, it doesn't belong in your nasal cavity, and that can cause a lot of problems. And so we had to make sure, and thankfully, you can laugh because it had come out at some point. We don't know when, but it wasn't there, and it wasn't where it didn't need to be. And I'm so glad, aren't you? So Kaya's okay. She's here today and probably sticking something else in her nose right now in our children's ministry. Thank you, Black Hawk Kids Ministry. We love you guys, because you never know, do you? But as I thought about that, I thought about this sermon series. I thought about how we do the same stuff. We try to force things into places they don't belong. We do the same thing where we should worship, where we should have a posture of praise, where we should not look left and right, but look to a God who gives us everything. We'll force in ourselves. We'll force those things, our praise, our worship, off the throne, off the trajectory of our life, and in its place we will put our pride, and it will spring up this root of bitterness. And so what do we learn from this story? Number one, don't stick plastic sandwiches up your nose. Number two, don't put in the place of gratitude and praise your pride, your bitterness. Maybe you've been doing that, and maybe you've been missing what God has in your life right now. And what happens with that kind of a posture is you want to get grace for us, don't we? Give me all the grace, God. We want to get grace for us, but refuse to give grace to them. You got a them? Gideon certainly did, and in verses 16 and 17, he became the first judge to turn the sword against his own countrymen, and he killed those people. And he went from a soft answer, turning away wrath, in Proverbs 15 and verse 1, now to Proverbs 15 and verse 33, I think he's characterizing here. The fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom, and humility comes before honor. He got it out of order. He put it in the wrong place, and he finds himself shifting now to this prideful bitterness. The third shift that we see here is from divine purpose to aimless revenge. Remember the other storyline? That was how he dealt with his friends. Now we're going to look at how Gideon is dealing with his foes, his enemies, these kings that he's tracking down and pursuing, these kings of Midian. We're finishing off the Midianites. God has given them the victory. This was a part of, and they would have a diplomatic process for how they go about it. It's still gruesome, but there would be trials, and there would be all these ways that they would have handled all this. But Gideon goes off script, takes things into his own hands again, and goes from this divine purpose and calling that God had given him. Remember, God called him to deliver his people. He did not call him to retaliate and get revenge that was personal. But yet, here we are. He shifts to this aimless, purposeless revenge. Verses 10 through 12, and then verses 18 through 21, and we'll stop there. You guys still okay with me today? Loving this Mother's Day sermon? Chapter 8. Let's go to verse 10. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor when, with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left, get this, the faithfulness of God here, all who were left of the army of the people of the east, for there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogbetha and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. Go to verse 18. We'll see this storyline continue. And what is he going to do with them? Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" We don't know about this battle until here. I'll break it apart more in a minute. And they answered, "As you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." Some foreshadowing to starting in verse 22 for next week. Verse 19. And he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. And in that TV drama, this is like the big bomb that gets dropped where everybody goes, oh, like, this is really personal for Gideon. And really, when I read this, I feel for Gideon. Can you think of the plethora of emotions of a high of such a great victory, yet losing his own family members? The highs and the lows of life and of following his Lord have led him to this. He's experiencing a little of everything. These people killed his family. And so this got really personal for Gideon. But he doesn't really handle it well, because here's what he says. He says, as the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, underline that, I would not kill you. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, who's probably a teenager at this point, rise and kill them. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, a lot like his dad in the beginning, remember that? Because he was still a young man. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. And again we go, whew, there's a lot there. But what we see here is a shift from divine purpose from God, now shifting to this aimless revenge in Gideon's life. He goes from retaliation with his friends now to revenge with his enemies. And verses 10 through 12 is pretty gruesome, just like the rest of the story is. But Gideon captures those kings, and they meet their fate, but how they meet their fate is quite interesting. And we learn of the battle at Tabor where Gideon's own family was killed. We didn't know about that until we get to this point of the story, and now because Gideon prompted it, we do know. So this became very personal to Gideon, and a lot of times when life gets personal, it gets really difficult, doesn't it? They used to say in seminary, the tough parts of ministry, this applies to life too, you just can't take it personal. And I found, a lot of times things get personal. People get kind of nasty. We're just kind of mean sometimes, aren't we? But what I've learned is what becomes personal in your life, you can't let it be permanent in your life. You can't live there. You can't dwell there. It may be personal, but you can't let that personal thing become a tool of Satan to pull you away from the divine purpose of God in your life. Unfortunately, Gideon does not really show us that as he responds to this. So I ask you today, what personal thing is the devil using today to pull you away from God's purpose in your own life? What has been personal that God is wanting to do something through his purpose in spite of, that the devil's using as a tool to pull you away from God's purposes? And I'll tell you, if you want to pursue God's purpose, you got to start here. If you want to pursue God's purpose, lay down your agenda. Gideon has a personal agenda, and if you want to follow after Jesus, you got to put his agenda first, your agenda second. Luke 9:23 is the words of Jesus, and Jesus says to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. What's that word? Daily. Say it out loud. Take up this cross daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes minute by minute, and follow me. It means putting God's agenda before my agenda. But instead, Gideon, verse 19, he says, if you wouldn't have killed them, I wouldn't kill you. And isn't that what we do so many times in life? If you wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have to now do this. Or if you would have done what was right, I'll do what was right. This is where Gideon ends up. It's this aimless, purposeless revenge that comes from prideful bitterness in his life. And we can be in the same spot. You're only one little slow fade, one little small drifting step away from being in these same places as Gideon. So beware of that kind of a mindset, because now personal blood vengeance has become the motive of Gideon instead of the call of God. Remember, God just said, deliver my people from Midian. He didn't say, go get personal vengeance. He didn't say, let this become so personal that you retaliate and that you get personal revenge in this. And we don't hear God speaking here. Why? Because I think Gideon kind of took some things into his own hand. Pride has seeped in, and this revenge mindset, if you, then I, steps in. So I ask you this question. How are you letting the actions of others control the course of your life? It's a tough question. We don't like answering questions like that, but boy, this would change some of the courses of your life and your pursuit of God's purposes if we could get this down and not let the actions of others. Listen, God sent me to tell you today, stop letting them control you and instead give control of your life to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He says, if I'm for you, who can be against you? What can man do to me? And it doesn't matter what people do to me. It doesn't matter what people do to you. If you're serving the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he's driving the course of your life, and you're not letting the actions or the inactions of others or the ways that God has or has not shown up, but instead letting God drive the course of your life, then he will fill you up even when life says you should be empty. He'll fill you with his purpose. He'll fill you with his plan. But Gideon shows us how to go the other direction. And then in verses 20 and 21, he asks his son, probably a teenager, to kill these kings. Now, why, would you say? Well, in this time, it was just as important how a dignitary like a king would die than why he would die. And because it has a lot to do with the respect and the legacy of that king. So Gideon didn't just want these kings dead, he wanted them disgraced. And so he even puts his son up front and says, well, you kill. And he might have gotten some glory from that, and maybe he had a good motive for his son in that and all these bad things. Who knows what was going through his mind. But he wanted to disgrace these kings and have a teenager kill these mighty warrior kings so that they would be disgraced. He's a little afraid. I probably would be too. And so Gideon does so himself. He kills these kings, and that's where our story ends for today. And then there's these crescent ornaments. If you want to find out why that's significant, we know a few reasons why, and I'll share them with you next week. So make sure you're here with us next week. And to all that you say, man, best Mother's Day sermon ever, Pastor. Right? I got 3 claps. Thank you so much. Hey, I don't know where you are. What can we learn from this? We can learn what not to do in all these shifts, can't we? But boy, we really learn. Here's the thing, guys. Listen. Have you read the end? Judges chapter 8, it's a lot of failure, not a lot of faithfulness. But I know what happens after Judges chapter 8. God's faithful, and he shows constant mercy, constant forgiveness. And I've read the end. You ever gotten here? Book of Revelation, who wins? He wins. But he invites us to be a part of his victory. And because of that, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 is true. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. My friends, faithfulness is not just something God does in the cycles of the judges and throughout the redemptive history of Israel and of humanity. Faithfulness is who God is. He's a faithful God, and he loves you. I want to ask you just to bow your heads and ponder the shifts that we saw in Gideon's storyline, the inadequate you that you are, and believers that are in the room. Perhaps it's time just to lay some things at the foot of the cross and just say, you know what, I've been letting others control me. I've got to give the steering wheel back to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, to the one who is the author of purpose and of faith today. I don't know what your step is, but God is ready to help you take it. And if that is you today, pause right now, reflect, but then respond to him. And some of you today, either watching us on a screen or in the room, and you would say, I just don't know that if I were to die today, I'd spend eternity with my God in heaven because of my personal relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. That is the faithfulness of God personified, by the way. It happened, it culminated at the cross. Even though knuckleheads like Gideon and you and me have stories like Judges chapter 8 in our life, God sent Jesus and he bore our sins, paying a price for them we could never pay by dying on that cross, and he rose from the dead. And because he lives, we can have eternal life. That is God's faithfulness to us. We don't deserve it, yet he gives it to us. We're saved by grace through faith, not of works. Then we might get prideful and boast about it. So lay your pride down today if you've never trusted in Jesus for salvation. Anyone who calls on the name of the Lord, believing Jesus is who he says he is, that God has raised him from the dead, you're going to be saved. Those are God's words, not mine. So trust in him. In your own words, cry out to him as the Spirit is drawing you right now, and you're grabbing the seat or the hand around you or whatever it feels like. Let go and give your life to Jesus right now. Reflect in this moment, but now respond as we pause.